Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's stay-at-home lecture. I am Tim Nutt. I'm director of the UAMS Historical Research Center, which is located in the UAMS Library on the UAMS campus in Little Rock. And just a few housekeeping things before we get started with the presentation tonight or this afternoon. The UAMS Historical Research Archives, or the Research Center, excuse me, is the archives for the of UAMS. Sorry, I was doing some technical stuff while I was talking. I got distracted. So we're the institutional archives of UAMS, which means that we collect all the institutional records, or try to collect all the institutional records for UAMS, which would include departmental reports, correspondence, photographs, and everything like that. And then in addition to that, we also collect materials that document the history of medicine and the health professions throughout the state. So, for example, we might have information on a doctor in Fayetteville who doesn't have any sort of association with UAMS, but we still collect that material simply because they practiced in Arkansas, and so we want to preserve that history and document their time in Arkansas. The stay-at-home lectures are sponsored by the Society for the History of Medicine and the Health Professions, which is the friends organization for the UAMS Historical Research Center. And they do lots of things to help support us, including helping us purchase materials such as books for our History of Medicine book collection, which is also a component of the Historical Research Center. They help with programming such as this and other programming throughout the year, like individual longer presentations, lectures, and things like that. We'd love for you to be a member of the society. The dues are relatively inexpensive, and they are $5 for students, and you can be a student anywhere. You don't necessarily have to be a student here at UAMS. And then an individual membership is $25. So if you're interested in joining, and I hope you are, you could go to the URL that is on your screen right now. I know that's kind of a long URL. You can also just go to the UAMS library website and go into the Historical Research Center website, and you can actually apply online, submit your application for membership online. Or you can bypass that, just go directly to PayPal, paypal.me/shmhp, and you can just pay your dues online, and then we can just transfer it into our bank account so you don't have to write a check. If you'd like to visit the Historical Research Center, I can tell you a little bit more about the society at that time. And I can also give you a tour of the facility and show you some of the collections that we have and the artifacts that we've been collecting and preserving that document the history of medicine in Arkansas. So I hope you'll consider either coming up for a tour, the contact information is on your screen, or signing up and becoming a member of the society and helping support the UAMS Historical Research Center. This, the stay-at-home lectures, as I mentioned, is a program of the Society for the History of Medicine and Health Professions. It occurs the first Thursday of every month from 12 to 1. I see my slide is wrong up here, but it's from 12 to 1 every day. And next month's presentation on September 5th is going to be on Wayward Girls of Hot Springs. And that's going to be by Janice Percival, who is a local historian from Hot Springs. And she's going to be talking about orphaned young women in Hot Springs and sort of how they were dealt with in Hot Springs, as far as medical situations and the law and everything that goes along with being in that situation. So hope you'll tune in next month to hear Janice talk about Wayward Girls of Hot Springs. And again, that's from 12 to 1 on September 5th, not 7 to 8, what it says up on the screen. So I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I am going to go back into and pull up my presentation for today. Today, we're going to be talking about Dr. in quotes, John R. Brinkley. And if you're familiar at all with Dr. Brinkley, you'll know that he is sort of infamous in Arkansas history and really throughout the country and in the history of quack medicine, patent medicines. He's sort of like one of the top quacks that there was back in the early 1900s. So we're going to talk a little bit about him, his connection to Arkansas, and how he ended up in Arkansas. And if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat feature. Just type in your question, and we'll take those at the end of the presentation. So let's begin. So as I mentioned, Dr. John R. Brinkley really invested in the patent quack medicine field in the early 1900s. And the title of this presentation, Glory, Grift, and Goat Glands. If you're familiar at all with Dr. Brinkley, you probably get the reference to the goat glands, but he was known as the goat gland doctor, and we'll get a little bit into that. But first, let's talk a little bit about how his biographical information and how he came to be who he became, and how he became who he was. So let's move forward. So he was born in Beta, North Carolina, which is in the western part of the state. You see the red dot up on your screen. He was born July 8th, 1885, rural part of North Carolina, very, very, born to a very, very poor family. And his birth was a little interesting as well. And so Beta, North Carolina, he doesn't spend a whole lot of time in North Carolina before he goes out into the world and sort of finds his profession. But he was born to Dr. John Richard Brinkley, and you see him on the screen, his father. And Dr. Brinkley, the elder Dr. Brinkley, fought in the Civil War, or served as a medic in the Civil War on the Confederate side. And he also practiced medicine in North Carolina. So he was a doctor. At that time, in the late 1800s, there were very few doctors who went to formal medical school. So most likely the elder Dr. Brinkley, most likely probably apprenticed with another doctor, although I'm not positive on that. So Dr. John Richard Brinkley married Sally Mingus, who you see on the screen as well. Now, Sally Mingus, that was not his first marriage. He had his first marriage, Dr. Brinkley's first marriage was annulled because he was underage when he got married. So that was annulled. And after he became an adult, he actually married 4 more times. So he was very prolific in the marriage department. So in 1870, when he was 42 years old, he married Sarah, nicknamed Sally Mingus, and they lived together in Beta, North Carolina. And at some point, Mingus's niece, Sarah Candace, moved in with them. And you'll notice on the screen that Sarah Candace actually has the name Brinkley as well. That's because the elder Dr. Brinkley got the niece, Sarah Candace, pregnant. And from that pregnancy came John Romulus Brinkley, who we now know as Dr. John R. Brinkley, the younger. The three of them lived together. They called, that's when they started calling Mingus Sally to differentiate between the two Sarahs. So you have Dr. Brinkley, the elder Dr. Brinkley, you have his wife, Sally, and his niece, Sarah, who he just had a baby with, John Romulus Brinkley. And so he was named Romulus after the mythical, one of the mythical founders of Rome, who was suckled by a wolf. And so that's how he got his name. Now, Sarah, the younger Sarah, died of pneumonia and tuberculosis when her son was 5 years old. So Sally became sort of his surrogate mother. And Dr. Brinkley and Sally remained married. He did not marry Sarah, the younger Sarah. So after the younger Sarah died, they moved to another nearby town, still in North Carolina, and that's where John Romulus Brinkley, the younger, sort of grew up. And he grew up in this cabin. A lot of these early photographs are actually from an autobiography that Dr. Brinkley wrote. So this is the cabin where the younger Brinkley and his father and his aunt lived. And you have a picture of John R. Brinkley around 10 years old in 1896. So he lived there for a while. Later, he moved to New York City, where he worked for Western Union. And after that, he moved to New Jersey. So he was kind of a person that just moved around a lot. In 1906, he returned home when his Aunt Sally was unwell. She died later that year. And he found comfort in the arms of another Sarah. Sarah went by the name of Sally again, Sally Wiki, and she was 1 year older than the younger Brinkley. And they got married in 1907, in January 1907. So not too far after or long after the Aunt Sally died. Aunt Sally died on December 25th, 1906, and they got married on January 27th, 1907 in North Carolina. From there, Dr. Brinkley and his new wife, they traveled around. They posed as Quaker doctors. They would go from small town to small town to small town, where they would perform a medicine show and sell patent medicines, which was very common at that time. During that time in the early 1900s, there were just tons of patent medicines being produced all over the country. And patent medicines, if you're not familiar with it, they claim to cure everything that ails you. So you would have patent medicines that would say that they could cure cancer, they could cure sexually transmitted diseases, they could cure the flu, everything. And usually one bottle would cure everything that was wrong with you. But most of the medicines, the main ingredient was alcohol, a lot of alcohol in it. And often there would just be a few other ingredients like mint or just whatever, something to make it taste, to sort of take away the taste of the alcohol. So that's what they did for a while. And this is when Dr. Brinkley, the younger Dr. Brinkley, is sort of getting into his groove about how the rest of his life is going to play out. So after being in North Carolina and going from these towns for a while, they eventually moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, and Dr. Brinkley set up a sort of a practice where they would treat, he and another doctor in quotes, could treat ailments. So you'll see the advertisements on your screen, advanced medical specialists, and the diseases they could treat, rheumatism, diseases of the skin, constipation, enlarged prostate, loss of vigor, which is going to come back and be sort of a prominent in Dr. Brinkley's career later on, specific blood poisons, kidney and bladder diseases. So really anything that you could think of, and diseases peculiar to women, all curable, nervous diseases, chronic, special, and blood diseases. So here we see Dr. Brinkley setting up a formal office to cure diseases. So they stayed there for a little while, and then they moved. Then Dr. Brinkley decided that he wanted to go to medical school. Even from a young age, he wanted to be a doctor. Not necessarily a charlatan doctor. He wanted to be a legitimate doctor. Unfortunately, that would never really be the case with him. But later in 1907, after they'd been moving around for a few months, they ended up in Chicago. And that's when their first child was born, Wanda Marion Brinkley. And while they were in Chicago, Dr. Brinkley enrolled at the Bennett Medical School there in Chicago. Now, that was an unaccredited school, so the American Medical Association didn't really recognize that school as being a legitimate school. And there he focused on eclectic medicine. So you'll see schools where they're eclectic, there's osteopathic, allopathic, and so he chose the eclectic route. While he was also in Chicago, he worked again for Western Union. So he would work for Western Union at night, and he would go to medical classes in the daytime to pay for the tuition and raising his family. 1908, he and Sally, his wife, had another child, but that he only lived a couple of days. So the relationship between his wife and Dr. Brinkley got kind of contentious with the financial situation, him going to school, him working for Western Union. And so there was a lot of trouble in the marriage. And at some point, Dr. Brinkley came home from school. His wife and young daughter, Wanda, were gone. He eventually found her, but then Dr. Brinkley actually kidnapped his daughter and left. That did not last very long. They found the daughter, as you can see by the newspaper clipping, and they ended up actually getting back together for a little bit. Sally eventually filed for divorce again. She was claiming she was going to do for a divorce. That's what sort of prompted the problems. Him kidnapping the daughter. They came back. They reconciled a little bit. Then she'd filed for divorce again. So that was sort of the end of their rocky marriage but he would get married again. Now, it was at Bennett Medical School that Dr. Brinkley was introduced to the study of glands and their effect on the human system. So it was here where he first developed his interest in transplantation of glands from animal to human, which would become a very big part of his career later on. Let's see. So in 1911, they moved back. They reconciled again, and they moved back to North Carolina for a little bit. He did not have the money to pay his education bills to Bennett Medical College, so that sort of dogged him throughout his career for a few years at least after he was at the Bennett Medical School. So when they went back to North Carolina, and he began working as an undergraduate physician. So he had taken some of these classes. He became an undergraduate physician, excuse me, but he didn't get a lot of traction in North Carolina. And so he picked up again. They moved to Florida for a little bit. They went back to North Carolina, and they just sort of moved around a lot. And by this time, he had another daughter, Erna. And so this family of four, they were just sort of traveling around, trying to establish Dr. Brinkley in some sort of, so he could establish some sort of practice. So in 1912, and you'll realize that, you know, if you count the dates, it's happening pretty much in succession. So it's one year after another. All this is happening really, really quickly, right after another. So in 1912, Dr. Brinkley wanted to try his hand at school again, and he applied to a number of schools, but he didn't have any luck because Bennett Medical College had sent around things saying that he didn't pay his education bills. So even though he had been initially accepted into these other medical schools, eventually he was denied admission because of these unpaid bills to Bennett Medical College. But he finally got into Eclectic Medical University in Kansas City, which was a notorious school, if you can call it a school. And it really was just known as a diploma mill where you could just pay money and really not just take these sort of not legitimate classes and end up with your diploma and become a medical doctor. So Dr. Brinkley actually just purchased his diploma from Eclectic Medical University. And later on, Eclectic Medical University and some of these and then some of the other schools like it were closed down through the American Medical Association as being frauds. In 1913 in Kansas City, they had a third daughter, Naomi was born. And immediately after that, the family moved back to New York City. If you'll remember, Dr. Brinkley had gone to New York City for right after he sort of became of age, and spent a couple of, maybe a year there before moving back to North Carolina. But after Naomi was born in 1913, they moved to New York City. They did not stay there very long because they never stay in one place very long. And they ended up back in Chicago. Dr. Brinkley still wanted to become a doctor, a real doctor, and his wife had had enough. And so she left him for the final time and took their three daughters and moved back to North Carolina. So Brinkley then moves from Chicago, he moves to South Carolina, and he sets up a storefront business where they offer treatment for syphilis. And they call themselves the Greenville Electromedic Doctors. And so with this other doctor, they placed advertisements to sort of lure these men in. And then they also started talking about and sort of promoting the idea of increasing a man's vigor and vitality. And so men would come to the Greenville Electromedic Doctor's office, where they were they were given the shots, but it turns out that the shots were just colored water, so with food coloring, and they would charge these men $25 a shot, which back in what are we at now? 1913, 1914. So if you took that in today, $25 a shot back then would equal about $800 in today's currency. So these men would pay about $800 for a shot of colored water, telling them that it was, it would improve their vigor. And they would use the syphilis kit that you see on the screen as part of that was the kit that they use, and they would use Salvarsan that they would say that was what they were giving the patients to make them sort of healthier and bigger and get rid of the infection and make them full of vigor and vitality and such. So this happened for only a couple of months. They were only in South Carolina for a couple of months. And then they had to leave really, really quickly because they had unpaid medical bills and unpaid utility bills that were piling up, and creditors were coming after them. So they hurriedly left South Carolina, and they ended up in Memphis, Tennessee. So pretty close to Arkansas. They're not in Arkansas quite yet, but they ended up, the Dr. Crawford and Dr. Brinkley, the Greenville electromedic doctors, ended up in Memphis. So it was in Memphis where Dr. Brinkley met his second wife, Minerva Talitha, nicknamed Minnie Jones, and they got married in 1913. And Minnie Jones, she was a friend of Crawford's, his fellow doctor, his co-worker, and the daughter of a local physician. So they got married after only a 4-day courtship. They only knew each other a few days. They got married. They got married at the Peabody Hotel, even though he was still married to his first wife, Sally. They had never formally divorced, so he was still married to Sally when he married Minnie. So they honeymooned in Kansas City, Denver, Pocatello, Idaho, and Knoxville. It was in Knoxville where Brinkley was arrested and taken back to Greenville, South Carolina for the unpaid debts that he and Crawford had run up. And he was put in jail for writing bad checks, and he was also put in jail for practicing medicine without a license. Now, while he was in jail, Brinkley told the police that everything was the idea of his colleague, Dr. Crawford. And gave the investigators all this information on Crawford, telling them where they could find him. And so they were able to go out to Idaho and arrest Crawford. And interestingly enough, he was brought back to South Carolina, and the two were put in the same jail in Greenville, South Carolina. Now, right around this time, Minnie and Brinkley had a son, John, and he was called Johnny Boy. And sometimes you could hear Johnny Boy on radio broadcasts. We're going to get to the radio broadcasts here soon. So the lawsuit that had happened in South Carolina was settled out of court, and they agreed to pay some of the unpaid bills. So that's sort of got them back on track. And Brinkley's new father-in-law, if you'll remember, was a physician, so he'd help pay Brinkley's bail to get him out of jail. Brinkley got out of jail. He went back to Memphis, and guess who shows up in Memphis but his first wife, Sally, who tells the new wife that they're not divorced, and John Brinkley is actually a bigamist. So Minnie, his second wife, and Dr. Brinkley moved to Judsonia in Arkansas. And it was in Judsonia where he again obtained an undergraduate license to practice medicine. And he advertised, and he particularly catered to women, and his specialty were diseases of women and children. He didn't make, again, he wasn't able to establish himself in Judsonia. And so he joined the Army Reserve Medical Corps. But so he was still looking, though, to sort of form his own clinic. And so he finally accepted an offer to take over the practice of another doctor who was leaving town. And it was then at that time that he was able to make a profit for the first time really in his life. So much so that he was able to pay off his debt to the Bennett Medical College, which freed him up, and that debt was not following him wherever he went. So he was able to pay Bennett Medical School while he owed him in tuition. And then in October of 1914, the Brinkleys moved from Judsonia to Kansas City, where he enrolled in the Eclectic Medical University again to finish out his last year of study there, where he could finally get a license, official license, not just paying for a diploma. And so Brinkley graduated in 1915. And that diploma from the Eclectic Medical University allowed him to practice medicine in 8 states. And it was at this, if you'll remember, it's at the Eclectic where he just sort of honed his interest into glands and, the different effects glands would have if they were diseased, if they were healthy, everything about glands. And it was also at the Eclectic Medical University that he came to study problems of the prostate gland, which would also come back later in his career. So he's living in Kansas City now, he and his wife. So when he's in Kansas City, he takes a job at Swift and Company, the plant in Kansas City. And while at the Swift and Company, he was sort of the company doctor. So he would take care of minor wounds, animal physiology. And it was at this was a sort of a slaughterhouse meat packing company. And it was there that Dr. Brinkley discovered that the healthiest animal slaughtered at the plant was the goat. And the goat would become sort of pivotal to his later medical career. So it was at Swift and Company where he saw that the goat was the healthiest animal. So in 1917, he's an Army reservist. He was called up for service during World War I. Here's his draft registration card. He only served a little over 2 months and then he was later discharged because of a nervous breakdown. In October of 1917, Brinkley and his wife moved again, this time to Milford, Kansas, not too far away. After spotting, there was a newspaper advertisement saying that the town needed a doctor. So with his new license, new diploma from Eclectic, they moved from Kansas City to Milford, and he sets up shop there. And that's where he and his wife would stay for a number of years. So in 1918, they moved to Milford. He opens up a 16-room clinic in Milford, and you can see the clinic. He named it the Brinkley Jones Hospital. 16 rooms. He paid good wages to the nurses. He really invigorated the local economy. He did house calls. He was especially helpful, they say, during the 1918 flu outbreak, where he treated a number of patients. And everyone really thought very positive things about him in Milford. And he did a lot of things to help Milford in the economy. But it was also out in Milford where he really started getting into this, really putting into practice what he had learned and his thoughts and sort of perceptions of glands. This is where the goat comes back in, where, you know, the goat that he had learned about at the Swift Company in Kansas City. So he came in Milford, he thought of this idea about men and losing their vigor as they grow older. He recognized again and remembered that the goat was considered one of the healthiest animals. And so he sort of got fixated on this idea of implanting goat testes into men to reinvigorate the men and give them more vigor and vitality. So, he said in his autobiography that he came up with this idea because when a patient came to him and would say that, you know, he was sexually weak, Brinkley would respond that the patient would have no problem if he had a pair of those buck glands in you, buck goat glands in you, end quote. So then this patient supposedly just begged Brinkley to do this, implant goat testes into him, and so he wouldn't be so sexually weak, which Brinkley agreed to for $150. So he got $150 for doing this operation. Now, the son of the man who had this operation said it was actually reversed, and Brinkley offered the man $150 if he would go through this operation. So no matter how it happened, the operation took place, and it just sort of, the reputation sort of built, and he just performed more and more of these operations. And he would go on and advertise and say and continue to claim that these operations would restore male virility and fertility. And so he sort of had a booming business going on. People started flocking to Milford to get this operation. The cost of the operation went up from $150 to $750 per operation. In today's terms, that's about a little over $11,000. So paying $11,000 to having goat testes implanted into you. Now, after these, the operations, they were considered successful, but the body, after the operation, the body would basically just absorb these testicles, and they would just, they did not graft. The body did not take the glands, and so basically they were just put inside the scrotum or the abdomen of men or of women. He did not. Later on he also offered this operation to women, and so and he would just sort of put them near the ovaries in the woman. Supposedly there is a 75% success rate. There were also charges, you know, some of it say that it didn't work at all. And then there were also charges that Dr. Brinkley was drunk in the operating room. A number of patients ended up with infections after the operation, and some of the patients died, although we don't know how many died. But between 1930 and 1941, Dr. Brinkley was sued more than a dozen times for wrongful death during the operations. But he continued doing it. And his reputation grew, and he grew even more when in 1920, a child that was supposedly born from a man who was considered not able to produce children was able to impregnate his wife after having this goat gland operation. And so he built on that perceived success and started advertising that Billy, that was the name of the little boy after Billy Goat. Billy was born in 1920, and so he started really building up again this idea that goat glands could reinvigorate you and actually produce children. And you'll see the other advertisement on your screen. "I am rejuvenated," cries a goat gland patient. "Just look." So in addition to the goat glands producing children and vitality and improving vitality, Brinkley also began promoting the goat glands as a cure for 27 other diseases, ranging from dementia to emphysema to flatulence. So the goat glands could pretty much cure anything that might ail you. He started mailing direct junk mail to people regarding the operation. And he hired an advertising agent. And it was this advertising agent who started promoting the goat gland operation. And they came up with this tagline that "the ram that I am with every lamb." So every man should become the ram that he is or I am. So he started looking at that. Now with this, though, new publicity came more scrutiny and increased attention, especially from the American Medical Association, which sent an agent to the clinic to investigate. He did it undercover. And the agent found a woman hobbling around Brinkley's clinic, and she had been one of his patients. She had been given goat ovaries as a cure for a spinal cord tumor. And at this point, Dr. Brinkley got onto the American Medical Association's radar, and they would eventually be his downfall. But for the time being, he enjoyed a lot of success. So at the same time as Dr. Brinkley was doing this, you also had other doctors around the world, Sergei Voronov, who was experimenting with monkey testicles. And he was implanting monkey testes into patients as well. So Brinkley was not the only one doing this type of operation around this time. There were others who was doing it as well. Now, Brinkley just Dr. Voronov was having this sort of a lecture in Chicago. Dr. Brinkley went to Chicago hoping to watch the surgery. He was barred. That caused a bunch of new press, but it turned out to be positive. Since he was barred, it was accused that Dr. Voronov was jealous of Dr. Brinkley's success. And so it was just, it was monkey glands versus goat glands in the press. But the goat gland business continued to be profitable to him, so much so that the publisher of the Los Angeles Times newspaper invited Dr. Brinkley out to California with the idea that he would support opening up clinics, goat gland transplant clinics in California. But he said a condition of that is he wanted one of his managing editors to get the operation, and if it was successful, then he would publicize Dr. Brinkley's operation. He would help him set up these clinics in California and Mexico. And so Brinkley and his wife went out to LA. They performed the operation on the managing editor of the LA Times, transplanted the goat glands. By all newspaper accounts, it was a success. Now, California, but to do this operation, though, California did not recognize Dr. Brinkley's license, his diploma from the Eclectic Medical University in Kansas City. So the publisher, Harry Chandler, had to get a special permit, a 30-day permit that allowed Dr. Brinkley to perform this operation in California. It was considered a success by all accounts, brought new attention to Dr. Brinkley. It was publicized in the LA Times and other newspapers. And it's rumored that even some Hollywood film stars at the time contacted Dr. Brinkley and went through this operation, although I could not find any names dealing with that. And Dr. Brinkley in his autobiography says that he was so taken with the city, he loved sort of the vitality, no pun intended, of LA, that he wanted to move he relocated his clinic from Kansas out to LA. But the California Medical Board denied his application for a permanent license to practice in the state, having found his resume quote, riddled with lies and discrepancies. And so Brinkley returned to Kansas and began to expand his clinic in Milford, in Kansas. So while in Los Angeles, though, he toured KHJ, which was a radio station the publisher of the LA Times owned. And Dr. Brinkley had this epiphany, and he saw the power that broadcasting over radio could have in building his business and promoting his services. So in 1923, he built KFKB, which stood for Kansas First, Kansas Best, or sometimes Kansas Folks Know Best, using a 1 kilowatt transmitter. But at the same time, the American Medical Association was coming after all these diploma mills. You'll remember that the Eclectic Medical University was considered a diploma mill. Exposés in newspapers were sort of advertising all these diploma mills. And so when Dr. Brinkley was received a indictment for practicing medicine with one of these diplomas from the diploma mill. Agents from California came out to arrest Brinkley, came to Kansas to arrest Brinkley, but the governor of Kansas refused to extradite him to California because he brought so much money to Milford. And so it was sort of a stalemate between Kansas and California, but they refused to extradite Brinkley back to California because of what he did with the economy in Milford, bringing in patients from over the world. He helped fund a new sewer system in the town, and he even sponsored sports teams called the Brinkley Goats, a baseball team that went on to win some games in Kansas. Now, this radio station, KB, he started advertising more and more, promoting his business, advertising his business. And in those advertisements, he would just sort of make fun of men with low stamina and encourage them to come to his clinic to get goat glands. transplants, but he would also provide a little bit of entertainment, and this would come back that he would find useful, and he would use this later on. And he would promote local musicians and things like that. So he just added so much to the economy and to the, he was really a good master at promoting himself. An article about the Brinkley goats and their baseball. And he also had this thing called medical question box on KFKB, where people would write in and about issues, problems, medical issues, and he would answer over the air. At this time, he also began talking about how goat glands could also help male prostate problems. And so he would bring in a whole other group of people. And he would also prescribe these medicines that were made by the Brinkley Pharmaceutical Association. And they were trademarked. They were only available through Brinkley, and there was questions would come up later that if there really was a Brinkley Pharmaceutical Association, if these drugs were actually being compounded themselves, or they were just taking other medicines and putting their name on that. But the profit that Brinkley was making at this time was just mind-boggling. It's said that in 1 week he made $14,000 a week, which in today's terms would be a huge, huge amount. So moving on, I know I'm running out of time. In 1932, he decided to run for governor. He lost. He ran again a couple of years later. And he was just sort of a populist. He, sort of the movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? The sort of the governor in that one. That's sort of like how I imagine Dr. Brinkley operated. So eventually his radio license in Kansas was denied. So he built a new station in Mexico on the Mexican side of Del Rio, Texas. And that's when he really started blasting his advertisement out. He built a 300-foot tower and named the radio station XER. And went on the air in 1931. And this thing was a 50,000 watt radio station, and which could broadcast far and wide. And he used that broadcast to continue his business. He still had his clinic in Kansas, and so he would go back and forth. But it was in XER, excuse me, where he would really come to sort of hone the skill of using the radio. And it was on XER that a lot of the early musical artists of Americana, like the Carter family played on XER. So that's going on. The American Medical Association is still coming after him. He finally decides to shut down his clinic in Kansas and moves it to the Hotel Roswell in Del Rio, Texas. 1934, from pressure from the United States, the Mexican government revokes Brinkley's broadcast license. And then they're continuing to go, the American Medical Association continues to go after him for the goat gland operation. So he sort of shifts into doing vasectomies and prostate rejuvenations. So he kind of gets out of the goat gland business. Built a big, nice mansion in Del Rio, Texas, which is still there. Morris Fishbein, who was with the American Medical Association and had learned of Brinkley and his operations way back when, and so they had become they were nemesis. And so Fishbein really was the one that eventually took Brinkley down, writing exposés on medical malpractice and fraudulent and quack operations, things like that. So in 1938, that's when the sort of the downfall of Brinkley began. Brinkley sued Fishbein for libel and $25,000 and $250,000 in damages. Went to court. The jury found in favor of Fishbein that he wasn't liable and did not slander. And the jury actually said that Brinkley should be considered a charlatan and a quack in the ordinary, well understood meaning of those words. And so that sort of opened up the floodgates where there were more and more lawsuits coming out against Brinkley. So Brinkley moves his operation. Just a side note, Norman Baker, another charlatan who was also in Mexico and Del Rio at the same time, they were sort of nemesis as well. Norman Baker was offering cures for cancer. When all this started going down, the AMA started cracking down. Norman Baker moved to Eureka Springs, where he opened up the Baker Hospital in the Crescent Hotel, where he offered cures for cancer. And Brinkley moved to Little Rock. He opened up a hospital on Schiller Street in downtown Little Rock. And then he also purchased an old country club. It's now Mary Lake Monastery out in East End. And that was where his hospital operated until his death in 1942. In 1939, the lawsuits just kept piling up against Brinkley, and sort of he really lost all of his fortune, and he died penniless. He was buried in that's cancer again, and he was buried in Memphis in 1942. And you'll see his monument, his gravestone. And I think a few years ago, the angel on top of that was stolen from his gravesite. And I don't know if they've ever recovered that or not. But anyway, I'm sorry I ran so late today, but that is the story of Dr. Brinkley and his ties to Arkansas. And I will also note that this is, I did a separate presentation on quack medicines, and so that's on the YouTube channel. If you want to go and see that one, this one will be on the YouTube channel as well. We have a couple of minutes left, and I'm sorry I ran so right up to the time that we have to close off. But if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer any questions. If there's not any questions, I will let you go. And again, thank you all for being here today. I know that's a lot of information I crammed into that 1 hour. So if you'd like to find out more about Dr. Brinkley, please feel free to email me, pgnutt@uams.edu. Happy to help you do any more research or learn more about patent medicines. But thank you all for being here, and I'll look forward to seeing you September 5th from 12 to 1 with Janice Percival on Wayward Girls of Hot Springs. Thank you. Y'all have a good day.